Hey guys, weary traveler, and welcome to this cozy corner of history. Tonight we'll talk about the medieval night specifically, how people slept. Sleep wasn't one long stretch but broken, mysterious. People would wake up in the middle of the night to do things you might find hard to believe. Before we set off on this journey back in time, I truly want to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Isn't it amazing that across so many time zones, nations, and cultures, we can meet here together, exploring the mysteries of history? So, if you're passionate about stories like these, feel free to leave a comment, share where you are, and how you feel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly feel this journey is worth it. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, looked at the clock to see it's only 2 a.m., and wondered, why am I awake? Is this insomnia? If you lived in medieval Europe, the answer would be very different. No, that was perfectly normal. Sleep back then wasn't like the solid 8-hour block we know today. Medieval people followed a strange pattern called segmented sleep, dividing the night into two distinct phases, the first sleep and the second sleep. Between them was the watch, a time when people didn't stay in bed, they actually lived in the middle of the night. When the sun set, life shifted completely. No electricity, no street lights, no television or phones. The darkness swallowed villages and even cities. People went to bed early, often just after a modest dinner. A few hours after their heads hit straw piles or feather mattresses, the first sleep began deep, lasting about 4 hours. Around midnight, something curious happened. They woke up intentionally, not from anxiety, not from insomnia. For them, waking up was a natural part of their rhythm. They would light candles, stir the fire, and enter the watch. This period lasted 1 to 2 hours. And surprisingly, it wasn't wasted. Medieval people saw it as golden time for things the noisy, busy day didn't allow. Religion saturated every part of life back then, and sleep was no exception. Between sleeps, many knelt to pray, recited psalms, or sang hymns. Monks saw it as the ideal moment to turn their minds toward God, silent, dark, and pure. Even common folk might read or listen to scripture, believing their hearts were most open after that first rest. To them, if God called them tomorrow, at least their soul had been cleansed in the night. But it wasn't just prayer. The midnight waking was full of practical tasks. Farmers checked livestock, was the cow loose? Had the fire died out? Others did light chores like mending clothes, peeling roots, or even writing. And yes, it was also the time for intimacy. Medical and marriage texts of the period noted that after the first sleep, the body was settled, the mind calm, the perfect state for couples. It's no accident that large peasant families often grew thanks to this midnight watch. In some villages, neighbours even met at midnight. People visited one another, chatted, or discussed business. Records say some merchants even signed contracts at this hour when minds were clearer, and there was no daytime noise. So the medieval night wasn't as silent as we might imagine. It had its own rhythm, sleep, wake, sleep, and that waking time wasn't abnormal. It was life. Literature of the time often mentions first sleep and second sleep. Geoffrey Chaucer himself wrote of characters waking after their first rest. Medical texts, diaries, even court records confirm the concept. It wasn't a personal oddity, it was a cultural habit across Europe for centuries. Modern sleep researchers, studying communities without artificial light, discovered the same pattern. Humans naturally drift into two phases of sleep when left in natural conditions. In other words, segmented sleep may be our original biological rhythm, erased only when industrialization, gas lamps, and then electricity forced us into one continuous block to fit work hours. Picture it, a winter night in the 13th century. You, a peasant, curl up in a timber hut with a thatched roof. Outside, the wind howls, inside the fire flickers. After 4 hours of deep rest, you stir awake to the faint bark of a dog, the shuffle of cattle in the stall. You rise, add wood to the fire, your wife pulls a wool cloak around her shoulders, and together you whisper a prayer in the darkness. Maybe you step outside, gaze up at a star-filled sky, a sky we rarely see today through electric haze. An hour later, you return to your straw bed, drifting into the second sleep until the rooster crows. Then a new day of labour begins, and segmented sleep has quietly restored your strength not once, but twice in a single night. Beds in the medieval world weren't the warm, cozy spaces we imagine when we say bed. For most peasants, it was nothing more than a pile of straw or hay stuffed into a rough sack if they were lucky. Otherwise, straw was spread directly on the floor. Dampness and mould clung to it, turning the bed into a haven for fleas, lice, and sometimes a stray cat seeking warmth. Winter nights were filled with the rustle of hay and the scratch of itching skin, sounds people simply learned to live with. For slightly better off families, the straw pile was lifted onto a rough wooden frame. It didn't make things much softer, but at least it kept bugs from crawling straight into their ears or moisture from seeping into their bones. Sometimes they laid a cloth over it, though laundry was rare, and the cloth itself soon became another nest for insects and grime. The idea of blankets and pillows was very different too. Blankets were often old animal hides, daytime cloaks, or anything that could trap heat. A pillow might just be a sack of straw or your own folded arm. Commoners slept in their everyday clothes, partly to save time, partly because winters were brutal. Pajamas didn't exist. The idea of changing into special sleepwear was considered wasteful, even absurd. Privacy in sleep was almost non-existent. In a one-room thatched hut, parents, children, even grandparents slept together on the same straw heap. In large families, the sleeping space became a tangle of arms and legs. People grew used to waking up with a sibling's elbow across their face or a foot pressed against their side. In the biting cold, body heat mattered more than comfort. In rural homes, even small livestock often shared the sleeping space. A dog curled at the bed's foot, chickens scratching nearby, sometimes even piglets pulled inside to keep warm. The poor called this their living stove. The grunts and shuffles of animals became the soundtrack of the night. Children might wake to flapping wings or a goat stepping over them, but even chaos was better than freezing to death. Unlike the peasants' straw beds, the nobility's beds were a different world. Inside cold stone castles, they built oak or walnut frames carved with intricate patterns. On these frames lay thick mattresses stuffed with feathers, wool, or dried moss replaced regularly. Over everything, they spread layers of linen, woolen cloth, and sometimes embroidery with gold thread. These beds even had curtains, not just for decoration, but to block drafts from the doors and keep warmth in. At night, with the fabric drawn, it felt like a small private chamber, shielding its owner from the cutting cold of the castle. For nobles, a bed was a valuable possession. It was listed in wills and passed down to the next generation, on par with land or jewellery. In some families, heirs might not inherit fields but would receive an aunt's bed, a symbol of prestige and status. A bed, draped in damask, feather-filled, with carved woodwork, wasn't only for sleeping. It was proof that the family was wealthy enough to defy the winter. Yet, class differences couldn't erase one shared reality. Sleep was rarely comfortable. Whether on damp straw or feather mattresses, people faced the same persistent enemy, fleas and bedbugs. Some nobles even hired people whose only job was to pick lice and vermin, a humiliating but necessary task. Remedies were strange: burning, strong-smelling herbs, stuffing garlic under pillows, or sprinkling ashes onto beds. The idea of a bedroom barely existed. Peasants slept in the same room where they cooked, worked, and stored goods. Within those wooden or stone walls, life unfolded in one shared space. Nobles sometimes had separate bedchambers, but even they weren't free from the noises of the castle. Howling winds in the corridors, rats scurrying in the walls, guards switching shifts. The absolute quiet of modern sleep was a luxury no one knew. In these beds, children often huddled with their parents under a shared animal skin. Fairy tales weren't gentle bedtime stories but warnings. Demons lurking in the dark, safety only found by staying close to kin. A bed wasn't just a place to rest, it was a fortress against the night, where the small unit called family gathered to survive until dawn. And if medieval beds were crude or crowded, their sleepwear wasn't much better. The idea of pajamas didn't exist. Common folk usually slept in the same clothes they worked in, crawling under straw or animal hides. Blankets were scarce, nights were cold, and every scrap of fabric mattered. Their clothing was rough, wool-long tunics, tight hose, patched and worn thin. After long days in the fields, sweat soaked the fibres, dirt clung to every thread, and at night they lay down in the same garments. It wasn't laziness, but necessity. Washing clothes was exhausting. involving hours of scrubbing in cold water and ash, followed by days of drying. So they slept in, the stench of sweat, earth, and smoke. Still, one item stood out as a medieval sleep essential: the nightcap. Not the drink, but an actual cap. Houses were freezing, walls and roofs let in drafts, and windows were covered with thin horn or oiled paper. The head lost the most heat, so a simple cloth cap was the first line of defense. Nightcaps came in many shapes, but the most recognizable were long, pointed ones dangling like a jester's hat. They were made from wool, linen, or leftover scraps. Everyone wore them: men, women, children, and the elderly. Married women used them to keep their hair covered, as custom demanded modesty even in sleep. In some places, letting your hair loose in bed was seen as careless, even sinful. The nightcap also carried social meaning. Wealthier families embroidered them, or edged them with coloured trim, a silent message. Even in sleep, I have status. In towns, answering the door in your nightcap was a polite way of saying, I'm done for the day, don't disturb me. Often paired with a long nightshirt, medieval nightwear was practical but comical. The nightshirt was little more than a rectangle of fabric with a hole for the head, loose, long, and plain. It covered from shoulders to knees or ankles, keeping people warm and modest if they had to rise in the night to stir the fire, visit the privy, or meet unexpected guests. But it was far from comfortable. Itchy wool, rough seams, and fabric that could chafe the skin. Some said wearing one felt like being wrapped in a stiff sack. In richer homes, nightshirts were finer, made of linen or rough silk, sometimes embroidered at the collar and sleeves. Still, they were nothing like the comfort of modern sleepwear. Fire hazards added danger. The long trailing fabric easily caught flame from candles or hearths. Chronicles even tell of monks and noblewomen whose sleepwear ignited, turning peaceful nights into tragedy. Like beds, nightwear reflected social class. Peasants slept in their work clothes. The middle class had plain nightshirts. Nobles enjoyed full night attire, long caps, linen gowns, even thick cloaks. In their frigid castles, they might wear woolen socks too, something rare among barefoot peasants. And beyond warmth, layered clothes offered a shield against the tiny invaders, lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Long sleeves and caps were like soft armor. Some even tucked garlic, onions, or pungent herbs into folds of cloth, hoping the smell would repel insects. Whether it worked or not, one thing is certain: the medieval bedchamber was filled with odors that made sleep anything but peaceful. Sleepwear wasn't just a personal matter. It was a blend of practicality, belief, and social status. The long nightcap dangling over the shoulder kept the head warm, but also preserved dignity. The loose nightshirt covered the body, but also reminded people that nighttime was never safe. You always had to be ready. And even the nightclothes of a noble, no matter how finely crafted, still carried within them the constant fear of cold, of fire, of insects, the common obsessions of all of medieval Europe. Here, the idea of a private bed, or even a private room, was almost a luxury. People didn't just sleep together as families, they also slept with strangers. For one person to have a bed of their own was so rare it could be seen as strange or even suspicious. At night, sleep wasn't a private journey but a communal ritual. In inns, scattered along trade routes, travellers had no choice but to share beds, and not just two people, sometimes 3 or 4 would cram into the same straw pile or worn-out mattress. Whoever arrived first claimed their spot, and the rest squeezed in. Privacy was sacrificed for warmth and safety. Many merchants found themselves sleeping next to strangers, even beside someone with festering wounds or thunderous snores. Yet this was accepted as long as there was still space. In cities, larger inns functioned almost like medieval dormitories. One long hall lined with beds, where merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers lay side by side. Snores, tossing, coughing, all merging into a night symphony nobody wanted. Space was divided loosely. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, monks with monks, thieves with thieves. But these divisions weren't always kept, and in the end, the real rule was simple: whoever fit. For peasants, collective family sleep was everyday life. In a thatched cottage barely a few dozen square meters, parents, children, even grandparents all lay together on one heap of straw. In winter, this became a survival tactic, one body warming another. Warmth mattered more than comfort. Children grew up used to elbows in their faces or cousins' feet pressed against their ribs, used to the sound of a grandfather's cough in the dark. In monasteries, collective sleep took on a different form, strict, disciplined, and soaked in religious spirit. Dozens, even hundreds of monks slept together in one great hall. Beds were nothing but planks or thin straw mats. They slept in their habits, knees nearly touching, no curtains, no soft pillows, everything arranged in perfect rows, in absolute silence. A noise too loud, even a groan from shifting, could earn punishment. In the dim glow of candles, the silence wasn't peace, but the discipline of a holy army. Sleep wasn't for pleasure, but to train the soul against temptation. For nobles, even with private beds, collectivity still lingered. Husbands, wives, children, servants, and guests often shared a room. A castle's bedchamber might hold 3 or 4 beds, the family all together. Guests were welcomed into bed curtains as a gesture of courtesy. A noble woman might wake in the morning to find a servant asleep at her feet, and no one found it strange. The fear of darkness also made sleeping alone dangerous. People believed demons, wandering souls, or even loneliness itself could harm those who slept alone. Children were taught that only by lying beside their parents or siblings would they be safe from spirits. Some monasteries even punished monks forced to sleep alone, believing solitude could lead to sins of the mind. Communal sleep didn't just bring warmth and safety, it created lasting memories. Pilgrims remembered cramming with strangers, guarding against thieves while clutching scraps of blanket. Peasants remembered the heavy breath of the whole family blending in the night. Monks remembered the flicker of candlelight on gaunt faces, straining to keep silent. Nobles remembered the whispers and coughs of servants echoing in cold stone halls. At every level of society, shared sleep was the norm, not the exception. Only when the modern age arrived, with larger homes and the rise of individuality, did people grow used to sleeping alone. But in the medieval world, the long night was always the story of many bodies tangled together, sharing warmth, odours, and the fear of endless darkness. Sleep wasn't just a biological need, it was a ritual with deep religious and spiritual meaning. Each night, when darkness fell, people entered sleep as if stepping through a fragile gateway toward death. Around sleep, customs, rituals, and strange beliefs grew shaped by constant fear of death and the supernatural. Before bed, most families prayed. Not just a habit, but a duty. Words like, "If tonight God calls me, please receive my soul," were spoken by peasants and nobles alike. To them, any night could be the last. Plague, fire, robbery, or simply winter cold could take a life. So every sleep began with spiritual readiness for death. Dreams were seen as messages from the beyond. A dream of saints or light was a blessing. Nightmares, on the other hand, brought fear, a warning from demons. Dream interpretation books spread across Europe, assigning meanings. Fire equals punishment, water equals cleansing of the soul, black cats equals lurking devils. Sometimes a person's fate was judged entirely by the dream they described in the morning. Fear of demons and wandering spirits was especially strong. People believed that while sleeping, the body weakened, and the soul might slip away, leaving the body open to demonic attack. To guard against this, families hung crucifixes over beds, tucked charms of iron or herbs under pillows. Parents marked children's foreheads with ashes in the shape of a cross before bed, believing it kept evil away. One curious custom: avoiding sleeping on the back. Medieval people thought lying flat with arms out resembled a corpse. If the soul thought the body was dead, it might leave and never return. Parents warned children, curl up, sleep on your side, never let the night turn into your grave. This fear even led some to sleep, sitting backs against walls or chairs to avoid resembling the dead. In monasteries, sleep was tied to nightly prayer rituals. Monks rose around the third watch to chant matins, a weapon against the devil. They believed the darkest hours were when demons roamed strongest, and prayers then had special power to protect the community. For them, sleep wasn't just rest. It was part of a holy battle against the forces of night. Beliefs extended to bedtime itself. Sleeping too late after church bells was thought to invite demons or misfortune. Going to bed early with prayer was considered righteous. In some places, people out wandering late could even be punished, their behavior seen as dangerous for the whole village. Sleepwalking, too, was wrapped in superstition. Those caught wandering with empty eyes at night were believed to be possessed, sometimes even subjected to exorcism. In some villages, children prone to sleepwalking were tied lightly to their beds, not as punishment, but to keep their souls from wandering too far. Alongside fear came protective rituals. Families slipped knives under pillows, believing sharp iron repelled evil. Some scattered salt around beds, seeing it as purity demons couldn't cross. In Scandinavia, garlic was placed at the head of the bed as a holy fence, all with one purpose: to keep the sleeper safe from the invisible world. In that world, sleep wasn't just a time of rest, it was a ritual full of symbolism. Every night, medieval people lay down as if testing fate. If they were lucky, they would wake up in the morning. If not, their souls would drift into the next world. That's why prayers, charms, sleeping positions, and dreams all blended together into a web of customs and beliefs, turning sleep into something both familiar and sacred. And if anyone imagined that medieval sleep unfolded in absolute silence, with nothing but the wind howling at the door, they would be mistaken. The truth is, the night was a chaotic soundscape, so noisy that it's a wonder people managed to sleep at all. First, there were the church bells. In nearly every European village, the bell tower wasn't just for religious rituals, but also the clock of the community. Bells rang for prayer, for guard shifts, or for special events. At night, they could toll 3 or 4 times, waking the whole village. Many peasants got used to it, even called it a metallic lullaby. But for outsiders, it was endless disruption. In monasteries, the bells were even harsher. Monks could be woken at any hour for prayer. The sound of the bell pierced through stone walls, echoing in their chests, turning sleep into fragments. A monastery night wasn't silence, it was bells, prayer, then more bells. And beyond the bells there was the village itself. Roosters crowing too early, dogs barking non-stop, cows lowing, sheep bleating, all of it filling the night. Animals sharing houses with people never stayed quiet. Pigs rolling over, chickens flapping, dogs barking at shadows. Children woke up crying, dragging their families awake again. For medieval people, sleeping through such noise wasn't the exception, it was the norm. In towns, the noise was worse. Narrow streets were alive with the shouts of late-night vendors, wooden wheels grinding against cobblestones, guards tapping their spears along the road. At midnight, drunken songs, fights, even the cries of an execution could drift through windows. If you lived near a market, the noise never really stopped from dawn until long past dark. And in castles, there was no escape. Wind whistled down stone corridors, doors creaked, chains clanked, guards' footsteps echoed. The vast cold halls turned every sound into something ghostly. Many nobles drew their bed curtains not just for warmth, but to muffle unsettling echoes. Beyond daily noises came the sounds of war and nature. A besieged village might try to sleep through horns, hammers forging weapons through the night. Winter storms pounded thatched roofs, thunder shook walls, snow collapsed roofs and buried families alive. Near forests, the howls of wolves carried into homes, making children tremble while parents muttered prayers. And strangely, in all this chaos, medieval people developed extraordinary resilience. They learned to sleep through the noise, just as soldiers learned to sleep on battlefields. Bells, animals, wind together, they became the soundtrack of life. So much so that if a night was suddenly too quiet, people felt uneasy, fearing it was a bad omen. Looking back, medieval sleep wasn't sweet or gentle. It was a constant negotiation with the dark. They slept in straw, huddled with family, pressed against livestock, wrapped in heavy clothes, praying by candlelight, fighting off insects, cold, and superstition. Bells, wind, animals, war, all of it woven into the long night. And yet, in those harsh conditions, people still managed to rest, to endure, and to live another day. Sleep, something we think of as ordinary, stood as proof of human resilience in one of history's darkest times. Winter, 1692. Cold winds from the Atlantic swept through the dense forests of New England, slipping into the wooden houses of Salem, a tiny community of only a few hundred, yet carrying fears larger than any city, the fear of the devil. That night, in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, something was wrong. Firelight flickered against the wooden walls. In the corner, 9-year-old Betty Parris suddenly sat up, screaming, her eyes wide and vacant. Beside her, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, her cousin, collapsed to the floor, her body jerking as if an invisible hand was choking her. Panic filled the house. Neighbors rushed in, whispering, "God help us, the children are possessed." The fits returned again and again, strange mutterings by day, terrifying screams by night. No physician could explain it. They tapped Betty's body, questioned Abigail, but found no natural cause. And in this harsh Puritan community, if it wasn't sickness, there was only one answer. The devil had entered the village. Rumors spread faster than the winter wind. Salem whispered that the children had seen dark shapes in their dreams, that Satan's hand tormented them. Each night, the Paris home filled with worried neighbors. They didn't just hear the children cry, they heard them speak of shadowy women at their bedside, of pale spirits hovering at the door. Such words planted terror in minds already haunted by guilt and sin. Salem wasn't just cornfields and cattle. It was a strict religious enclave, where even a frown could be judged as sinful. People believed the devil prowled everywhere, waiting to seize the weakest soul. What happened in the Paris house was like a spark thrown on dry straw, the whole village ready to burn with accusation. As families gathered by candlelight, tension thickened. If the minister's daughter was possessed, then who was safe? Suspicion grew in every glance, every gesture, and from that small wooden house in Salem village, the tragedy began, a tragedy that would drag the community into a storm of fear, accusation, and blood. Betty and Abigail's torment didn't stop at fits. In the days that followed, their behavior grew even more disturbing. Sometimes they screamed strange words, their voices rasping as if someone else spoke through them. Other times, they crawled like animals, growling, eyes rolling back, saliva dripping from their mouths. The adults recoiled, clutching their prayer beads. Many became convinced demons had taken the children's bodies to mock God himself. Those fits soon spread beyond the Paris household. Before long, other children in the village began showing the same strange signs. Ann Putnam, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott. One by one, they screamed, convulsed, and claimed to see dark figures standing in the corner, whispering their names. Their stories were eerily similar, as if they were all controlled by some invisible force. People whispered, "Satan has laid his hand on Salem." Doctors were called in, but after checking pulses and searching for injuries, they could only shake their heads. No wound, no sickness could explain it. Finally, one physician delivered the diagnosis everyone had been waiting for. This is not illness. This is witchcraft. That declaration fell like a blade, ripping apart the fragile calm of the Puritan village. In that society, religion ruled every breath. Sin was preached each Sunday. God's judgment hung over every head. When a doctor spoke of witchcraft, there was no doubt it was truth. The convulsions, the screams, the night terrors, all were taken as proof that Satan had servants living right inside the community. Prayer meetings turned into interrogations of children. Reverend Paris, the elders, and the crowd urged them, "Speak. Who did this to you? Who is the witch that harmed you?" Under pressure, the girls trembled and named names. At first, it was those already disliked. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. Sarah Osborne, a strange widow, who rarely went to church, and Tituba, the Caribbean slave in Reverend Paris's own household. The community sighed with relief. Finally, culprits. But the judgment was built on nothing more than children's frantic screams. Night after night, in cramped rooms lit by candles, the girls pointed and cried, "That witch is here!" And another name was added. Instead of doubting, villagers believed even more. Children were thought to be innocent and pure, incapable of lying. If they said witches were real, then witches were real. The village atmosphere shifted daily. People looked at each other with suspicion. An old woman became a target just for muttering while passing someone's home. A man was condemned because his cow died suddenly, and neighbors swore, "Surely a witch's hand is in this." Any strange event, lightning strikes, withered crops, sick livestock was instantly blamed on magic. Meanwhile, Betty and Abigail became the storm's center. Adults crowded into the Paris house, waiting to see the children, chosen by God, to unmask the devil. At times, the room shook as a girl screamed, collapsed, and pointed at a phantom only she could see. The crowd murmured, "We are witnessing the battle of God and Satan." The testimonies, the cries, the names, like a deadly play unfolding. And as the fire of suspicion spread, no one in Salem realized they were opening the door to one of the worst episodes of mass hysteria in American history. The three names shouted in Reverend Parris's cramped house quickly became the focus: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. To Puritan eyes, all three were outsiders, easy to throw into the fire of suspicion. Sarah Good was a beggar, wandering the village with a broken pipe in hand, muttering strange words. People already avoided her for her smell and her temper. When Betty and Abigail accused her, no one was surprised. They remembered the time Sarah begged for food, was refused, and muttered curses. Dead livestock, sick children, failed harvests, all linked to her gaunt figure with bloodshot eyes. That night, whispers rose like a verdict. She has been a witch all along. Sarah Osborne was different. Not poor, but considered odd. After her husband's death, she married a servant, something the strict Puritan community saw as sinful. She rarely went to church and stayed apart from rituals. Her difference made her the perfect target. When the girls screamed her name, the community nodded. Of course, she's been distant from God for years. But the name that thickened the air was Tituba, the Caribbean slave in Reverend Parris's household. In Salem, a closed, white Puritan town, Tituba was both foreign and low-born. The image of her telling folk stories to children now became proof she had planted the devil's seed. When a trembling girl cried, "It was Tituba who came in my dream," the crowd turned to her as if she had always been wrapped in darkness. On the 29th of February 1692, all three were arrested and dragged before the judges. The scene was like a play already written. Sarah Good screamed and denied it, but her frantic voice only convinced the crowd that Satan spoke through her. Sarah Osborne, weak and ill, tried to defend herself, but her long absence from church was seen as undeniable proof. Tituba was different. Cornered and relentlessly questioned, she did the unthinkable, confessed. In the dark room, under dozens of stares, Tituba said she had met the devil, that he appeared as a black dog, a tall man, and that he commanded her to serve him. She went further, claiming there were many other witches hiding in Salem, plotting to destroy the village. Her confession struck like lightning. The crowd trembled. No longer was this dismissed as children's games or lies. If one witch admitted to accomplices, then the enemy was truly among them. There was no going back. Panic multiplied overnight. If Tituba spoke the truth, then more names would surface. People glanced around, eyes scanning every face. Anyone who quarreled, stood out, or seemed different could be the others in this imagined network of witches. Like a rising tide, the whole community was swept into a hunt. For the three women, fate was sealed. Sarah Good became the model of the bitter, poor witch. Sarah Osborne, the woman who dared defy norms, was proof that leaving the church meant Satan would claim you. And Tituba, with her chilling confession, had flung open the door to a collective nightmare. From that moment, Salem was no longer the peaceful village of the New World. It became an arena of fear, where anyone could be accused, and every denial only strengthened the verdict. This one is a witch. After Tituba's confession, the mood in Salem shifted overnight. Whispers turned into public shouts. Suspicious glances became outright accusations. If there was a whole network of witches hiding, then anyone could be next. Fear spread like an infection, quickly beyond control. At first, the focus stayed on outcasts, the poor, the widows, the wanderers. But soon, the wave of accusations reached further. The wealthy, the respected, even the revered. The more names were called, the more convinced people became that Satan's roots ran deep in their midst. One of the most shocking accusations struck Rebecca Nurse, an elderly woman long seen as a model of virtue. Kind, devoted to family, known for her piety. But that was exactly why, when the girls cried her name, the community shuddered. Some refused to believe it, but doubt was crushed quickly. If even she can be possessed by the devil, then who among us is safe? Her name became proof that no one stood beyond suspicion. Next came Martha Corey, a loyal member of the church. When she dared to question the children's accusations, she was immediately branded as someone trying to protect fellow witches. Resistance, instead of bringing reason, became proof that she was on Satan's side. The village quickly learned a new rule: Whoever asked questions was suspicious. The hysteria didn't stop with women. Men were pulled into the storm as well. John Proctor, a wealthy landowner, criticized the trials as absurd. He scolded his daughter for taking part in the madness, but those words were as good as tying a noose around his own neck. He was quickly labelled as one standing in the way of God's justice. His wife, Elizabeth Proctor, and eventually his whole family, were dragged into suspicion. The more people were accused, the more the panic fed itself. The girls, now the central witnesses, kept seeing spirits of others. They screamed in court, faked seizures, blaming the spectres of the accused for tormenting them. The crowd believed every word. Every collapse of a child on the courtroom floor, every shriek, was treated as undeniable proof that the accused was Satan's ally. The entire community lived under constant fear. Families were destroyed overnight, sometimes with nothing more than a child uttering a name. Friends turned their backs, neighbours eyed each other as enemies. The rich trembled, the poor were shaken. Everyone thought, tomorrow it could be me. Fanaticism was legitimized by the very authorities themselves. Judges and ministers believed they were fighting a holy war. They convinced themselves that the survival of the community depended on purging Satan's servants. Trials grew larger, sentences harsher. At its peak, more than 150 people were crammed into filthy jails, accused with nothing more than a pointed finger. Among them were farmers, merchants, the wives of landowners, even a minister. The prisons overflowed, prisoners tied together, starved, many dying before their cases were ever heard. From a tiny New England village, Salem transformed into the stage of collective madness. And the most terrifying thing wasn't the witches, because they didn't exist, but the sheer power of fear, fanaticism, and the belief that evil was lurking just next door. The number of prisoners grew so fast that the jails burst at the seams, forcing the Massachusetts colonial government to act. In May 1692, Governor William Phips created a special court, given the long English name, Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and decide. But in reality, it wasn't a court of justice. It was a machine that legitimized collective fear. The first trial unfolded like a public spectacle. Crowds packed the courtroom, waiting breathlessly for truth to be revealed. On the high bench sat solemn judges, facing trembling farmers, nervous housewives, even once respected townsfolk accused of witchcraft. And the most horrifying feature of this court was something called spectral evidence. This meant that if someone claimed they saw the spirit of the accused in a dream or seizure, their word was accepted as legal proof. If a child collapsed and screamed, "Her ghost is choking me," the room fell silent, and the accused was already halfway to the gallows. No physical evidence, no tangible proof. Just the screams of a few girls were enough to condemn a person to death. Anywhere else, such testimony would be laughed out of court. But in Salem, in 1692, it was accepted as the justice of God. The trials themselves were both tragic and surreal. The girls, now the accusers, would put on performances in unison. When questioned, they trembled, then suddenly collapsed, eyes rolling back, shrieking that the accused was attacking them with witchcraft. The courtroom gasped, the accused cried out their innocence, and the judges nodded solemnly, calling it clear evidence. The crowd roared for justice, and the wheel of hysteria rolled forward. A few tried to fight back. They denied everything, begging for reason. But denial itself was twisted into proof that they were hiding the devil. Meanwhile, those who confessed even falsely were often spared, because the court saw them as repentant, and so many, desperate to survive, fabricated wild tales of meeting demons, of signing Satan's book. These false confessions became evidence of a vast network of witches. The most notable judge, Samuel Sewall, later admitted his mistake. But in that moment, he and his colleagues truly believed they were on a sacred mission, saving the soul of the community. Oyer and Terminer was not just a court, it was a theatre where faith, fear, and prejudice were written into law. The more convictions there were, the more the frenzy grew. Death sentences began to fall, and gallows were built on a barren hill outside Salem Gallows Hill. The villagers flocked to executions like festivals, eyes burning with zeal as Satan's servants were dragged into the open. None realized they themselves, with blind faith, had turned the court into a killing machine. In the dim candlelight of the courtroom, every scream of a child, every word of a judge, was another nail sealing the coffin of reason. Salem had crossed a line, from suspicion to sentencing, from rumors to real death. The executions began, and Gallows Hill became the stage of death. There were no grand stone pillars, no mighty oak trees, just rough wooden scaffolds. Yet to the villagers, it was sacred ground, where God's justice was carried out. On execution day, crowds poured in, farmers, townsfolk, even wealthy ladies carrying folding chairs. Children perched on their parents' shoulders for a better view. They climbed the hill as if going to a fair, but this was no celebration, it was a sacrifice to fear. Everyone believed a witch's death would cleanse the village, bless the harvest, and protect their souls. The first to hang was Bridget Bishop, a woman in her 50s, known for wearing bright clothes and red jewellery, scandalous in a harsh Puritan town. Though she pleaded innocence, the crowd screamed, "Witch! Witch!" When the rope tightened and her body fell, the hill erupted in cheers. They believed Satan had lost an ally, but Bridget was not the last. One by one, the accused were led up, hands tied, ropes around their necks. Some prayed to their final breath, some stood in silence, some shouted defiance, but all met the same fate, swinging under Salem's grey sky. 19 people were executed this way in just a few months. Not all died by hanging. The most infamous case was Giles Corey, a 71-year-old farmer. He refused to plead guilty or innocent, knowing that if he confessed, his land would be seized and his children left with nothing. To force him, the court used a brutal punishment, pressing. They laid Corey in the yard and piled heavy stones on his chest. Each time he was asked, "Do you confess to being a witch?" he answered only, "More weight." His ribs cracked, blood filled his lungs, and he died in silence, a symbol of defiance against injustice. Inside the jails, conditions were so horrific that at least 5 people died before ever reaching trial. Emaciated bodies, starved, soaked in dampness, rats crawling over them. The nights echoed with moans, stinking of waste and sickness. For many, death in prison was crueler than the gallows. On Gallows Hill, each execution etched deeper into the community's memory. Children were told, "Look, that is what happens when you follow the devil." Adults whispered about the spectral evidence they had witnessed. Everyone left convinced that killing today was salvation for tomorrow. Yet even amid the cheering, a few doubtful eyes lingered. Some whispered that those who died had once been good neighbours, devout believers, friends. But in the frenzy, doubt itself was a death sentence. To defend the condemned was to invite suspicion. So the crowd chose silence, letting the wheel of blood keep turning. Gallows Hill became the symbol of Salem. The hill was small, but its shadow weighed heavily on the community. Each glance toward it recalled the bodies swaying in the wind. The ropes had become instruments of God in their eyes, but in truth, they had turned human beings into executioners of their own kind. Death followed death. Fear didn't fade, it grew, because with every life taken, the crowd became more convinced that more witches were still hiding. Salem was no longer just a village. It had become a vast prison without walls, where every glance was suspicious and every word could send someone to the gallows. After each trial, instead of calm, the village sank deeper into chaos. Death didn't soothe the panic. It only widened the circle of doubt. Neighbours looked at neighbours as enemies, friends as spies. Even family members could no longer be trusted. Families were torn apart in the madness. Wives accused husbands, husbands accused wives, children accused parents. In a world where silence was sin, many were forced to name their loved ones just to save themselves. A 12-year-old child stood before the court, trembling as she pointed at her own mother, saying, "She came in my dream and tried to strangle me." The mother broke down in tears, while the child was hailed as a witness of God. The whole village breathed in relief, believing Satan had been unmasked once more, while in truth, another family had been shattered forever. Even children weren't spared. Dorothy Good, just 4 years old, daughter of Sarah Good, was dragged into court. Under the weight of judges' questions and the crowd's shouts, the little girl nodded and confessed things she couldn't understand. They threw her into a dungeon, where darkness, rats and lice became her only companions. That fragile soul couldn't endure it and grew permanently broken. When Dorothy was finally released, she was no longer a normal child, she was a living witness to her community's cruelty. In tiny homes, fear made sleep restless. People whispered prayers, terrified that at dawn someone might knock on their door to take them away. One woman wrote in her diary that she didn't dare look her neighbor in the eye, because even a glance could be twisted into a sign of witchcraft. The entire village became a stage where everyone played a part, but no one knew when they would become the accused. Paranoia peaked when accusations spilled beyond Salem. The girls claimed to see witches from other villages, even distant towns. Rumors spread fast, and fear spread with them. Neighboring communities whispered that Salem was surrounded by Satan, and they could be next. The jails grew more crowded, groans echoing each night. But the scariest prison wasn't made of stone, it was the human mind. A coughing fit could be called a demonic attack. A strange glance could count as evidence. Reality and hallucination blurred. Reason and madness no longer had a line between them. The ministers and judges, rather than calming the people, kept fanning the flames. They preached that Satan was cunning, most dangerous when disguised. That meant anyone who appeared most pious might be the most suspicious. Even the most devout believers lived in fear that one day their name would be shouted in court. Salem was no longer a peaceful village of the New World. It was haunted by its own paranoia. Families destroyed, children thrown into cells, verdicts based only on children's screams, all blended into one dark picture. And across that picture stretched the shadow of fear, covering every roof, every flickering candle, every restless sleep. Accusations no longer stopped at the powerless or ordinary families. When hysteria hit its peak, it swallowed the powerful too. The children, now holding the power of life and death, didn't hesitate to scream names no one had dared touch before. One of the biggest shocks came when Lady Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps, was whispered about. Just the rumor that the First Lady of Massachusetts might be a witch shook the entire government. If the governor's wife, the colony's leading figure, could be accused, then who was safe? This was the moment the blade turned back. What had been a tool to enforce order and faith now threatened to destroy the very authorities who had nurtured it. Judges and ministers began to waver. The fear they had used to control the people now turned against them. And it wasn't just the governor's wife. Other respected figures were pulled in. Prominent ministers, wealthy merchants, even daughters of elders found themselves accused. The crowd, once quick to cheer at new names, now began to hesitate. They realized that if it continued, soon no one in Salem would be untouched. Governor Phipps, under mounting pressure, had to act. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Termina and replaced it with a new court that refused spectral evidence. It was a turning point. For the first time, political power questioned what had been seen as sacred justice. The change came not only from reason but also from fear of collapse. Wealthy Boston merchants protested, worried that reckless accusations would destroy the economy. Senior ministers, including Cotton Mather, urged restraint, warning that relying on children's words and spectral evidence might itself be Satan's trap. Within the community, a quiet awakening began. People remembered the kind faces who had died on Gallows Hill. They whispered, "Maybe we were wrong." Families who had lost loved ones began to question, and when the blade turned toward the elite, blind faith cracked. But this reversal didn't come from compassion, it came from survival instinct. The powerful only saw danger when it touched them. Farmers, widows, beggars, their deaths hadn't shaken the system. But when the governor's wife was dragged in, the whole machine stopped. After nearly a year of blood and tears, Salem finally began to slow, no more constant. Trials, no more death sentences celebrated. But the aftermath lingered. Broken families, children driven mad, jails packed with innocents. And the village quietly faced a terrifying truth. The nightmare they had fed had nearly devoured them all. When the court of Oyer and Termina was dissolved, the air in Salem shifted. The crowds that once crammed into hearings to cheer now sat silent. No more gallows verdicts, no more theatrical fits from the girls. Silence fell not peace, but heavy shock. Those once convinced they were doing God's work now felt lost. They looked around and saw dozens of families ruined, homes seized, children orphaned, parents hanging on Gallows Hill. The first whispers came, "Maybe we killed the wrong people." In churches, ministers began preaching the need for mercy. Some dared to admit mistakes. Samuel Sewall, one of the key judges, stood before the congregation and confessed he had sinned by condemning based on spectral evidence. His confession sent shockwaves, but it also opened space for new conversations. If a judge could be wrong, who could claim to be right? Governor Phipps, seeing the hysteria out of control, ordered many still imprisoned to be released. Jails that had been bursting slowly opened, but freedom came too late for many. Some had wasted away in cells, some families had no homes left, and some children were left orphans. Liberation arrived, but it could not undo the ruin. The community began to divide. Some still insisted that every execution had been justified, that it was the only way to keep Salem pure. But more and more people were haunted by the sight of innocent souls dragged to the gallows. Names like Rebecca, Nurse, and John Proctor, once honoured, were now whispered as symbols of injustice. In 1697, the Massachusetts government declared a day of fasting and repentance, calling it a time for the entire colony to beg God's forgiveness for serious errors in the execution of justice. But one day of fasting could never wash away the blood that had soaked into Salem's soil. Families of the victims sat silently in church, eyes filled with tears, knowing no apology could bring their loved ones back. Later, the colonial government issued compensation to the victims' descendants, but money was nothing more than cold ashes. How could silver and gold replace a mother, a father, or a spouse hanged in disgrace? The pain passed from one generation to the next, leaving Salem a scar that would never fade from America's memory. The little village returned, outwardly, to ordinary life, ploughing fields, tending cattle, going to church. But beneath the surface, shame lingered. Children who once cried out accusations grew up with the heavy knowledge that their words had killed. Judges, ministers, and officials lived out their years in torment. And every time a villager walked past Gallows Hill, the sight of swinging ropes returned in their minds. What happened could not be undone. Salem had drowned itself in blood and tears, only to wake and realize the real enemy was never witches, it was fear and human fanaticism. After the execution fires died down, Salem entered a heavy silence. But memory did not fade. More than 100 years later, people still whispered the names of the condemned, and shame still clung to the small town like a shadow that would never leave. The worst legacy of the trials wasn't just the 19 bodies on Gallows Hill, or the brutal death of Giles Corey. It was proof that a community could turn into executioners of its own, armed with nothing but fear, rumours, and blind belief. Salem became the living example of how society unravels when reason is replaced by collective obsession. From that tragedy, Massachusetts and later America learned a profound lesson. Never again should spectral evidence be allowed in court. Dreams, visions, and claims of the supernatural were permanently banned from the justice system, because once that door was opened, justice was no longer justice, it was a ghost serving hysteria. Salem also helped shape the idea of defendants' rights. The U.S. Constitution would later guarantee fair trials, the right to counsel, and the right to confront witnesses. All of these pillars of modern justice were strengthened by the painful memory of a time when a child's scream was enough to send a person to the noose. But Salem's legacy wasn't just in law. It became a mirror held up to society whenever hysteria took hold. In the 20th century, when McCarthyism, the political witch hunt, swept through America, people pointed to Salem as a warning. Fear can turn friends into enemies, rumors into verdicts, and a nation into its own prison. Popular culture kept the memory alive. From Arthur Miller's play The Crucible to countless novels and films, Salem became the symbol of the cost of fanaticism. Tourists visit Gallows Hill and witch museums not to find magic, but to be reminded that human cruelty is more terrifying than any supernatural force. Today, when people think of Salem, they no longer picture a tiny Puritan village. Salem has become a global metaphor for collective fear, unjust trials, and the way crowds can kill while believing they serve justice. It is a dark legacy, but also a lesson that cannot be ignored. Salem ended more than 3 centuries ago, but its ghosts never vanished. They don't wander the woods or hide in winter winds, they live in the human mind, where fear can turn into weapons and fanaticism into gallows. The Salem witch trials were not just a dark chapter of American history, they are a mirror for humanity itself. When reason sleeps, collective nightmares awaken. And only courage, justice, and compassion can keep us from repeating that tragedy. Rome, 1st century BC. A vast, crowded, wealthy city, but also chaotic and fractured. Dusty, stone-paved streets, noisy markets, statues of gods towering over the people. Behind the splendor lay a harsher truth. A republic breaking apart, factions battling endlessly, assassinations, trials, and riots becoming common. In this world, Roman women were expected to live in the shadows of men. They were taught to be obedient, loyal, wives and mothers silent in public affairs. They could inherit wealth, hold influence within families, but were barred from politics. The Roman Forum, the stage of debate, where the fate of the Republic was decided, belonged to men. And yet, in that male-dominated arena, one name suddenly blazed into history: Fulvia. She didn't come from the most powerful lineage, nor did she have the pedigree to become a symbol. But Fulvia possessed something rare for a woman of her time: open political ambition. She didn't just want to be someone's wife. She wanted to be a partner in power with Rome's most powerful men. Fulvia chose her path carefully through marriage. With Clodius Pulcher bold, arrogant, and a man who dared to challenge the Senate, she became the force behind his populist movements. When Clodius was killed in street violence, she turned his death into a rallying cry, stirring crowds and securing her own political foothold. Next came Curio, a young rising politician. Through him, Fulvia mastered the art of secret deals, understanding the balance between money, power, and loyalty. His death in an African campaign left her widowed again but never left behind. And finally, she married Marcus Antonius Mark Antony, the brilliant general and ally of Julius Caesar. This was her boldest, greatest, and most tragic union. No longer content to act from the shadows, Fulvia stepped openly onto the political stage, directly involved in decisions that would shape the Republic's fate. The sight shocked Rome. A woman not just tending home, but present in elections, assemblies, and negotiations. She spoke, she commanded, she mobilized crowds, things Romans believed only men could do. Fulvia didn't care about ridicule or scandal. To some, she was a transgressor. To herself, she was simply following her ambition, to seize power in the Republic's most chaotic hour. In Fulvia's Rome, wealthy and powerful women were not rare, but most chose to hide behind velvet curtains, pulling strings from the shadows. Fulvia was different. She stepped into the public eye, turning herself into a political figure. And it was that boldness that made her remembered as the first Roman woman to step out of the darkness and into the dangerous arena where politics and blood intertwined. In the years to come, Fulvia's name would be tied to struggle, to war, to downfall and legacy. But to understand that mixture of tragedy and glory, it begins here, with her decision not to live the life that Roman society reserved for women, but to enter the battle alongside the men who decided the fate of the Republic. Clodius Pulcher was no ordinary man. He was one of Rome's most notorious politicians, arrogant, ambitious, willing to unleash street violence to get his way. To many, Clodius was an opportunist, a nightmare for traditional order. But to Fulvia, he was the doorway into politics. From the beginning, Fulvia didn't act like a proper Roman wife. Instead of staying behind, she immersed herself in Clodius's noisy world. She attended secret meetings, met her husband's allies, and listened carefully to political plans. When Clodius led crowds through the streets, Fulvia was there beside him, watching every reaction, learning how he turned public anger into a weapon, a skill she would one day wield herself. Clodius was infamous for bloody clashes with his rivals. Rome's streets rang with the sound of swords, as gangs loyal to Clodius clashed with the opposition. At night, torches flared, blood stained the stones. Clodius at the centre, and Fulvia always knew every move. To her, this wasn't just violence, it was politics in its rawest form. In 52 BC, Clodius was killed in a street brawl. His body was carried home, blood still fresh. Many women would have wept, withdrawn, accepted the fate of widowhood. Not Fulvia. She turned Clodius's funeral into a massive political event. The body was paraded through Rome, so the people could see every wound. Fulvia stood before them, wailing, but every tear had purpose. She pulled back his clothes, showing the stab marks, the cuts accusing. This is not just the death of a man, but a crime against the Roman people. The crowd erupted. Outrage turned the funeral into a riot. They stormed the Senate house and set it ablaze. And at the heart of the storm stood Fulvia, not retreating into the shadows, but stepping forward as a lead actor on Rome's political stage. From that moment, Rome realized Fulvia was not just Clodius's widow, she was the heir to his fire. To the people, Fulvia became the symbol of injustice, the voice of the dead. To her enemies, she was a new danger, a woman daring to wield her husband's blood as a weapon to stir the masses. That moment marked a turning point. Fulvia had learned a vital lesson. In politics, public emotion was power, and women, if they knew how, could wield it as strongly as men. From Clodius's widow, Fulvia emerged as something entirely new. A Roman woman openly engaged in politics. She wasn't just swept up by the crowd, she led its emotions. And that was only the beginning of a journey that would bring her to the very heart of Rome's storm. After Clodius's death, many thought Fulvia's political life would end as well. A widow, no matter how intelligent or ambitious, had little place in a Rome ruled by men. But Fulvia was not a woman to let fate decide. Within a few years, she found another path, this time at the side of Gaius Scribonius Curio. Curio was different from Clodius. Younger, more charming, more careful in politics. If Clodius was a raging fire, Curio was the strategist, walking carefully among powerful factions. And Fulvia, now seasoned by her years with Clodius, entered her second marriage not just as a wife, but as a political partner. At that time, Rome shook with the conflict between Caesar and the Senate. Curio, once against Caesar, suddenly switched sides to support him, a shift many believed was due to Fulvia's persuasion and calculation. She understood that in the coming storm, siding with Caesar meant siding with the future. Fulvia continued the role she had sharpened under Clodius, the strategist behind the scenes. She built networks, cultivated alliances, secured financial and social backing for her husband. In meetings, her eyes no longer just observed, they commanded attention. People grew used to seeing a woman in political discussions, not just following her husband, but speaking with purpose. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon and civil war began, Curio became one of his young generals. Fulvia once again plunged into the whirlpool of blood and power. She wasn't only in Rome handling funerals or stirring crowds, she directly managed logistics, finances, and political connections for her husband. But fate struck cruelly once more. In the African campaign, Curio faced Pompey's forces. The battle was fierce, and Curio, brave but outmatched, was defeated and killed. Fulvia was widowed a second time. That pain might have broken other women, but Fulvia turned it into resolve. 2 husbands, 2 losses, and each time she only sank deeper into politics. With Clodius she had learned how to move the crowd. With Curio she had learned strategy, alliances, and the value of loyalty. Fulvia did not disappear after Curio. On the contrary, she grew tougher, more resilient. People began to see her differently, no longer just Clodius's widow or Curio's wife, but as a figure with her own authority. She proved that a woman could survive in Rome's brutal world not by hiding behind men, but by turning loss into a time weapon and marriage into a ladder of power. And then fate brought Fulvia to her third marriage, the one that would define her name in history, to Marcus Antonius, one of Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar's closest ally. This would no longer be just the background, this was the front line. Marcus Antonius Antony. Every Roman knew his name. A towering general, Caesar's right hand, as famous for his battlefield bravery as for his wild banquets. Loved and despised in equal measure. And when Fulvia married him, she didn't just choose a husband, she chose a powerful ally to step with her onto history's stage. Unlike her earlier marriages, Fulvia was no longer the learner. She was seasoned, scarred by loss, hardened by Rome's violence. She entered her marriage with Antony as an equal partner. No longer the woman behind the man, she stood beside him. Antony, impulsive and reckless, needed Fulvia's sharpness and tact. She became his political arm. While Antony commanded armies, Fulvia secured Rome's support, managed alliances, and stirred the crowds. When Antony needed popular backing, Fulvia knew how to ignite emotions and turn them into power. Together, they were a rare pair, the warrior and the politician, bound by love and ambition. Rome buzzed with gossip. A woman openly taking part in elections, influencing speeches, organizing factions. It shocked people. But Fulvia ignored the whispers. She knew that after Caesar's death, In a world drenched in blood and chaos, only boldness meant survival. And boldness was her choice. As Antony's power rose, Fulvia shone even brighter. She was not just his wife, she became a political figure in her own right. Roman sources, often biased against women, still recorded that Fulvia played a role in major decisions, even influencing her husband's strategies. It was unprecedented. A Roman woman stepping onto the political stage, not in shadows, but in full daylight. Their love was both passionate and dangerous. Antony adored Fulvia's brilliance, while Fulvia saw in him both a partner and a tool for her ambition. But their union also made them targets. Antony's enemies whispered that he was controlled by a woman. Fulvia's enemies called her the witch in a toga, daring to invade the male domain. The more she was despised, the more real her power proved to be. This marriage didn't just unite two people, it bound together two forces: the military power of Antonius and the political influence of Fulvia. In the blood-soaked years after Caesar's assassination, as factions tore Rome apart, their union made them one of the most formidable couples in the Republic. But it also placed Fulvia on a path more dangerous than ever before. With Clodius, she had tasted street violence. With Curio, she had witnessed civil war. But with Antonius, she would step directly into the eye of the storm, where one wrong move could destroy not just her career and her family, but her very life. And when Caesar fell beneath the daggers of conspirators, that storm broke open. On the Ides of the 4th of March, 4 BC, steel flashed in the Senate chamber. Julius Caesar, once hailed as Rome's savior, collapsed under dozens of stab wounds, delivered by men who had called themselves his friends. His blood stained the marble. His death cries echoed through the city. The Republic had just slain its dictator. That death split Rome in two. On one side, the assassins, Brutus, Cassius, calling themselves liberators of the people. On the other, the loyalists, led by Marcus Antonius, and standing beside him, in the shadows but with fire in her eyes, was Fulvia. Fulvia understood immediately. This wasn't just the fall of one man, it was the birth of another civil war. She refused to be pushed aside. When Antonius delivered Caesar's funeral oration, inflaming the mob, it was Fulvia who helped orchestrate it, ensuring every word spread like wildfire. She had learned from Clodius's death how grief could be weaponized, and now she applied that lesson on a far greater scale. In the streets, Romans wept, erected statues of Caesar, even burned the homes of the conspirators. Amid the chaos, Fulvia wasn't a bystander, she was weaving the threads, fanning the flames. Her presence ensured Antonius emerged, not weakened, but strengthened, his image reshaped as Caesar's true heir. Behind closed doors, Fulvia dove deeper into politics. She met with allies, urged the hesitant, and in oil-lit chambers, she spoke boldly. She didn't just whisper advice, she argued, proposed, even challenged seasoned politicians. Many men bristled, but they couldn't deny it. Fulvia's intellect and political instincts matched any of them. As Rome teetered in a power vacuum, new players entered. Octavian Caesar's adopted son, still barely more than a boy, stepped forward. Fulvia saw both promise and danger in him. She warned Antonius, "Act now, or this youth would win the people's hearts." History proved her right, but at the time, few men cared to heed a woman's warning. Fulvia herself organized Antonius's supporters, rallied voters, and made sure his voice carried. For Romans to see a woman in public politics was shocking, but Fulvia had long since broken barriers. Every move she made carved her reputation deeper, the only woman bold enough to stand in the storm. To her enemies, Fulvia was a threat. They mocked her, slandered her, saying she was just an ambitious wife manipulating Antonius from the bedroom to the Senate. But the truth was clear. Without Fulvia, Antonius might not have survived Rome's most chaotic days. She turned Caesar's death into Antonius's shield and into her own stage. Rome, after Caesar's assassination, was no ordinary city. It was a battlefield ready to explode. And in that chaos, Fulvia's image crystallized. No longer a widow turning funerals into riots. No longer just the silent wife, behind a man. She was now a player at the table of power, risking everything in the fight for Rome's future. In the wake of Caesar's death, the Republic wasn't just in flames, it was in suspense. Who would replace him? Antonius, Caesar's trusted general and ally, or Octavian, the young heir? In this vacuum, something unprecedented happened. A woman stepped forward as a political figure in her own right. That woman was Fulvia. No longer satisfied to stand behind Antonius, she appeared in public. She campaigned for his allies, stood in the forum addressing crowds, waving and commanding men like a leader. Romans sneered. A woman in politics, Rome has gone mad. But Fulvia didn't care. She was proving she didn't need to hide in her husband's shadow. Historians tell us Fulvia once held up an effigy of Octavian, ordering soldiers to strike its face, a public humiliation of her husband's rival. It wasn't just theatre, it was a message. She mocked her enemies openly, stripping them of dignity before the people. In the Senate, her name was spoken not just as Antonius's wife, but as a force of her own. She controlled networks, funded factions with family wealth, and held power when Antonius was away. Her critics spat venom, calling her the ambitious hag, the witch in a toga, the manipulator of Antonius. But their rage proved her influence. They wouldn't have hated her if she hadn't mattered. Fulvia didn't just use money or alliances, she used her presence. She walked the streets, roused the people, turned Caesar's death into a banner of justice. She strode among crowds like a general without a sword, armed only with fire in her eyes and power in her voice. Rome had never seen a woman like this. Others had power, but always hidden, always private. Fulvia stepped into the open. She became the first openly political woman in Roman history. Her boldness expanded Antonius's reach, but also carved her name, scandalous and unforgettable, into Roman memory. From that moment, Fulvia couldn't turn back. Once she stepped into the light, there was no retreat. Her only path was forward toward Perusia, where she would wield a sword, command an army, and test the ultimate limits of a woman in her age. The conflict between Antonius and Octavian grew sharper. Once united in the second triumvirate with Lepidus, now they eyed each other as mortal enemies. Antonius was away in the east, while Octavian tightened his grip on Italy. And in that vacuum, something Rome had never seen occurred. A woman became a war leader. Fulvia, alongside Lucius Antonius Marcus's brother, led the fight against Octavian. It wasn't reckless. She knew if Octavian seized Italy, Antonius would return to nothing. She acted not only for her husband's power, but for the political legacy she herself had built. Her image in those days became legend. She appeared before soldiers not in silk, but in battle garb. Her eyes blazed, her voice commanded. She urged loyalty to Antonius, to Caesar's cause. Even Roman historians, hostile to women, admitted Fulvia could ignite her troops, making them fight and die for her like a true general. The struggle became the Perusine War, 41-40 BC. Perugia, modern Perugia, was the battlefield. Lucius and Fulvia's troops clashed with Octavian's. Camps rose, axes chopped wood, hammers rang on iron. Fulvia walked the lines, reminding soldiers they fought not just for Antonius, but for Rome's future. But Octavian was no easy foe. He starved the city, cut supplies, and turned the war into a siege of hunger. Inside Perugia, food ran out, soldiers wasted away. Still, Fulvia endured, appearing daily, standing tall as a leader unbroken. Tales say she strode the walls, pointing at Octavian's forces, defying them like a commander. Courage, however, couldn't defy reality. In early 40 BC, Perugia fell. Lucius Antonius was captured, Fulvia fled. It was more than defeat, it was humiliation. For the first time, Rome had seen a woman command an army. Now it saw her undone. Octavian spared her life, but her reputation collapsed. Enemies called her reckless, a power-hungry woman who dragged Rome into chaos. Even allies turned cold, blaming her ambition for their losses. She left Italy, carrying the last remnants of her power, and went to Greece to find Antonius. But there, no comfort awaited. Antonius, already forming a new alliance with Cleopatra, saw Perugia as a burden. Some records say he was furious, blaming Fulvia for starting a pointless war that weakened him in his struggle against Octavian. For Fulvia, it was a mortal blow. The woman who had once rallied armies now faced suspicion from the man she had fought for. To many, she was no longer the powerful woman of Rome, but the symbol of a failed gamble. In Sicyon, Greece, Fulvia faded into loneliness. Illness struck, her body weakened. No cheering crowds, no adoring eyes, only whispers and blame. In her last days, perhaps she thought of Clodius, Curio, Antonius, the three men who had carried her upward and cast her down. Death came swiftly in 40 BC. She died in a foreign land, without trumpets or armies, remembered only in scorn. Fulvia, the woman who shook Rome, then fell in disgrace. But her death was more than a personal end. It revealed Rome's injustice toward women. A man who lost a war might still be honored as a brave general. Fulvia's defeat marked her as nothing but the ambitious wife, erased as a shameful exception. The truth is, Fulvia was never just someone's wife. She was the first Roman woman to openly claim politics, to weaponize public emotion, to wear armor and command soldiers. Her price was tragedy, but her name burned into history all the same. In a dark chamber in Sicyon, as her oil lamp flickered out, Fulvia closed her eyes. Rome could forget, Antonius could betray, but the image of her standing in the Forum, mocking Octavian, rousing the city would remain forever, proof of the unyielding drive of a woman stepping out of the shadows. Fulvia died in failure, but her legacy outlived her fate. In a Rome that confined women to households, she stood as the first openly political woman, shaping crowds, influencing decisions, and even leading troops into war. Ancient historians slandered her as ambitious, but their words are testimony to her power. She paved the way for later figures like Livia, Augustus's wife, to wield influence. Fulvia may have fallen, but she proved that even in the harshest world, women could carve their names into history with willpower, ambition, and fearless resolve. Fulvia wasn't a perfect heroine, nor an untouchable icon. She was human, loving, hating, ambitious, and paying the price. But that complexity is what makes her unforgettable. From the shadows of family to the walls of Perugia, Fulvia proved this truth. History does not belong only to men. It belongs also to the women who dare step out of the dark. Back in the days when gods still walked among mortals, there was a grand wedding on Mount Olympus. Peleus, a mortal hero, was to wed the sea goddess Thetis. All the gods were invited to the feast. Laughter filled the air, music echoed through the skies, and wine flowed without end. But one goddess was left out, Eris, the goddess of strife and discord. Furious at being excluded, Eris crashed the celebration. In her hand, she carried a golden apple, gleaming with an inscription, "For the fairest." That single apple would ignite one of the greatest wars in history. 3 of the most powerful goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. None of them would back down. What began as a wedding feast turned into a battlefield of pride. Zeus, lord of thunder, refused to decide any choice would offend a goddess. Instead, he turned to a mortal, Prince, Paris of Troy, famed for his fairness, beauty, and a fate that could not be escaped. Paris was given the impossible task of deciding who was truly the fairest. And so began the greatest beauty contest in mythology. Hera promised Paris absolute power to make him ruler of all Asia. Athena promised unmatched wisdom, glory in battle, and everlasting fame. But Aphrodite leaned closer, whispering the one gift no man could refuse: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman was Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Helen, praised as the Rose of Greece, so beautiful that 100 Greek heroes had sworn an oath to defend her from anyone who tried to steal her away. In that fateful moment, Paris handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. His choice wasn't just personal. It set into motion a tragedy that would last for 10 years. With Aphrodite's gift, Paris set sail for Sparta. There, under the goddess's protection, he met Helen. One glance, one whisper, and as if destined by the gods, Helen left her throne, left Menelaus, and followed Paris back to Troy. It was more than an affair, more than an abduction. It was an insult to Menelaus, a wound to the honor of all Greece. Outraged, Menelaus turned to his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, a man of ambition with the power to unite all Greece. The fires of war began to smoulder. Agamemnon saw his chance and summoned every king and hero who had once sworn to protect Helen. And so, from a golden apple at a divine wedding, from a single promise of love, a vast Greek alliance was forged, swearing to sail across the sea, to the gates of Troy, to win Helen back with blood and steel. Meanwhile, in Troy, King Priam, Prince Hector, and the people could not imagine that Paris's choice would bring ruin to their gates. Troy, famed for its strength, its wealth, its splendor, was about to become a battlefield where gods and mortals alike would clash, and where one of humanity's greatest epics would be written in fire and blood. The seed of tragedy had been sown. There was no turning back. From the moment Paris placed the apple in Aphrodite's hand, the wheel of fate began to turn, crushing joy, weaving sorrow, and driving mankind into a war that would rage for 10 long years. The Trojan War. Paris, the Prince of Troy, was not born into peace. At his birth, seers foretold, "This child will bring about the downfall of Troy." And so, his father, King Priam, ordered the infant to be abandoned on Mount Ida. But fate is never so easily escaped. Paris did not die. Instead, he was taken in by a shepherd, raised among flocks, far from the splendor of the royal palace. The young Paris grew into a man of striking beauty, his form balanced and strong, his eyes clear as a mountain spring. The people called him the fair judge. For time and again he settled disputes among shepherds with honesty and integrity that earned their respect. And so, when Zeus sought a mortal fair enough to judge the quarrel over the golden apple, the gaze of the king of gods turned to Paris. On Mount Ida, the fateful day arrived. 3 great goddesses appeared before him. Hera's radiance blazed like the sun, Athena shone with the majesty of wisdom, and Aphrodite glowed with a softness as eternal as spring. Each stood before Paris, not waiting idly, but offering promises powerful enough to shake any mortal heart. Hera, her voice thundering, raised her hand to the skies. "Paris, if you choose me, you will be lord of all Asia and Europe. None will defy your throne. You will rule with unlimited power." Athena, eyes gleaming, stepped forward. "Paris, if you give me the apple, you will have unmatched wisdom, strength in battle, and everlasting renown. Not merely a king, you will become a symbol of victory for all time." And then Aphrodite, her voice soft, her smile gentle, spoke without grandeur, without thrones or crowns. "Paris, I do not promise you power, nor wisdom. I offer you the one gift every human heart longs for most: love. You shall have Helen, the most beautiful woman on earth. She will be yours, as the moon belongs to the night, as the rose belongs to the dawn." In that moment, Paris's heart trembled. No throne could tempt him more than the vision Aphrodite painted. No victory could stir his soul more than the promise of burning love. Paris reached out and placed the golden apple firmly in the hand of the goddess of love. The heavens shook. Hera clenched her teeth in fury. Athena turned away in scorn, and Aphrodite smiled in triumph. From that moment, destiny was sealed. Paris did not yet know that his choice would bring mighty Troy itself to the edge of ruin. Aphrodite kept her word. Under her protection, Paris set out for Sparta, the powerful realm of King Menelaus. There, he was welcomed as an honored guest. And in the palace of Sparta, Paris laid eyes on Helen for the first time. She appeared like dawn breaking over the Aegean Sea, golden hair shining like silk, skin pale as ivory, eyes deep and blue as the ocean, and a regal presence that silenced every breath in the hall. Helen was not merely beautiful. She was the very embodiment of beauty itself, so coveted that once every king of Greece had fought for her hand. In the end, her father, King Tyndareus, forced them all to swear. Whoever won Helen, the rest would defend her with their lives. The man chosen was Menelaus, king of Sparta. But under Aphrodite's spell, when Helen's gaze met Paris's, time seemed to stop. A spark leapt forth, consuming every oath, every bond. Within days, Paris became the one Helen could not leave. Was it love or divine enchantment? No one could say. But Helen made her choice. She left her kingdom, left her husband and child, to follow Paris back to Troy. The news cut Menelaus to the core like a blade. The honor of a king was shattered, the oath of Greece's heroes mocked. In his rage, Menelaus turned to his brother Agamemnon, and both men knew this was more than the theft of a woman. It was an insult to all of Greece. From the moment Paris gave the golden apple to Aphrodite, fate had begun to spin its web. On the shores of Aulis, Greek sails trembled in the wind, preparing for a war unlike any before. And in Troy, Paris believed he held in his hands the gift of love. But that love was the very fire that would soon consume his entire city. Helen celebrated as the Rose of Greece, a beauty that drove heroes to madness. From the moment she came of age, kings and princes from across Greece flocked to Sparta, bringing gold, chariots, and fine horses. All sought her hand, but her beauty was too dangerous, so dangerous that her father, King Tyndareus, feared blood would be spilled if he chose wrongly. To solve this, Odysseus, the cunning hero of Ithaca, offered a plan. All suitors must swear an oath that whoever Helen chose, the rest would defend her and her marriage with all their strength. With that oath, Menelaus, brother of King Agamemnon, won Helen's hand in peace. But that same oath, years later, would bind hundreds of Greek warriors to march against Troy. When Helen abandoned Sparta to follow Paris, Menelaus's wounded honor was not his burden alone. It was a slap to every man who had once sworn that oath. Menelaus roared in his great hall, his beard bristling, eyes blazing like fire. "I have been shamed. Not only I, but all of you, those who laid your hands upon the altar of the gods. Now keep your word. March with me to Troy, reclaim my wife, and restore the honor of Greece." Agamemnon, his brother, smiled at these words. This was his moment. The king of Mycenae had long hungered to unite Greece and expand his power. A war with Troy, the wealthy city guarding the gates of Aegean trade, was not only about Helen, it was about treasure, glory, and dominion. Agamemnon agreed at once, taking command of the Greek alliance. News spread. Across the lands of Greece, the greatest heroes gathered. Achilles, the young warrior, son of the goddess Thetis, foretold to be the greatest of all Greek champions. Odysseus, the sharp mind, famed for cunning. Ajax, towering and indomitable. Nestor, the aged king, his voice like sacred fire, rousing the soldiers. Each came not only for the oath, but for honor, for the chance to carve their names into immortal song. They knew this war with Troy would be more than conquest. It would be the stage where legends were born. Meanwhile, in Troy, Helen passed through the towering gates, the massive walls said to be built by Poseidon and Apollo themselves. The people gazed at her with eyes of both awe and bitterness. They whispered, "Because of her beauty, war will soon fall upon us." Yet Priam, the old king, welcomed her as a daughter, hoping Helen's presence would prove Troy's strength, a city mighty enough to claim Greece's greatest treasure. But deep inside, Hector, the eldest prince, proud warrior, frowned. He knew Helen was not merely a woman. She was fire. A fire dazzling to behold, but one that could consume a city. Hector looked at Paris, his younger brother, and sighed. "Your love will bring blood upon us." Across the Aegean, thousands of oars struck the sea. War drums thundered. Wooden ships loaded with soldiers raised their white sails to the wind. A storm of war was gathering, all for the sake of one woman. In Troy's palace, Helen sometimes sat silently, gazing out at the sea. In her eyes, no one could tell if it was happiness, fear, or regret. She knew she had lit the spark of war, but was it truly her choice, or the invisible hand of the gods, turning her into their pawn? Either way, from the day Helen set foot on Troy's walls, fate was sealed. A 10-year war was about to begin. Greek heroes would storm the shores, Troy's great walls would quake, and epic songs would be sung born of blood and tears. On the shores of Aulis, the sun burned red like a massive drop of blood, shining down on thousands of white sails stretched across the horizon. The waves of the Aegean surged restlessly, as if urging them on, while the wind swelled against wooden sails, rushing like the spirits of warriors long waiting for this day. Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek alliance, stood at the prow of his flagship, his armor flashing like lightning. Beside him stood Menelaus, his face flushed with rage and the shame of a stolen wife. Behind them, hundreds of warships, each loaded with scores of soldiers, spears, shields, and bronze helmets gleaming beneath the sun. This was no small band. This was the gathered strength of all Greece. From Ithaca came Odysseus, with his sharp-witted, battle-ready men. From Phthia, Achilles, the young warrior with his immortal heel, led the famed Myrmidons. From Salamis, Ajax, towering like a fortress, whose every step seemed to shake the earth. From Pylos, Nestor, the wise old king, brought not only soldiers but counsel forged from long years. Every king, every warrior came for his own reason: honor, oath, hunger for glory, or simple ambition. But together they had become one storm, one force, called the Greek alliance. Yet before the fleet could depart, an ominous sign arose. The winds failed. The sea lay flat as a mirror, holding the ships in aweless. Rumours spread. The goddess Artemis was furious with Agamemnon. The king had boasted his archery outshone even the gods. Now Artemis demanded a price: the life of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. The news struck like a dagger to the heart. Agamemnon hesitated, torn between his daughter's life and the fate of Greece. But power, honour, and the coming war weighed upon him. Without sacrifice, the fleet would wither, and his glory turn to dust. And so, before thousands of soldiers, under their cold, unyielding eyes, Agamemnon ordered his own daughter slain upon the altar. Iphigenia's blood stained the stones. Red, and at once the winds rose, filling the sails and driving the fleet eastward. The sight left the army both shaken and aflame. They knew now the war had no turning back. Blood had been spilled, the gods had taken their due, and only the road to Troy remained. As the ships cut through the waves, songs erupted, battle chants, oaths of vengeance. Warriors pounded spears against shields, the sound rolling like thunder. They shouted Helen's name. They shouted the honour of Greece, swearing to tear proud Troy stone from stone. Meanwhile, across the sea, within towering walls, Troy remained unaware of what was coming. King Priam still trusted in the favour of the gods and the strength of his ramparts. Paris still believed in the power of his love for Helen. But Hector, the noble prince, cast his gaze toward the horizon, where white sails would soon appear, and his heart grew heavy. The ships pressed on, hundreds, thousands, advancing eastward. The Aegean roared, the skies held their breath. A war unlike any in human history was about to begin. And so, the winds of Artemis, the cries of Iphigenia, and the oaths of Greece's greatest heroes fused together, carrying the vast fleet toward Troy. A 10-year journey was about to unfold, a place where glory and tragedy would intertwine, where gods and mortals together would forge an immortal epic. When the first Greek sails appeared on the horizon, the people of Troy rushed to the walls. From afar, the Aegean looked white, not from waves, but from thousands of sails raised all at once. The sound of oars striking the water thundered like war drums rising from the depths of the sea. Troy, proud, wealthy, now stood as the target of a massive army. The Greek alliance landed. Their shouts shook the air, bronze shields flashing under the sun. The ground trembled as tens of thousands of feet struck the sand. In the first days, Greek soldiers swarmed onto the beach, raising tents, driving stakes, stacking timber, building a vast camp right beneath Troy's towering walls. But Troy's walls would not fall easily. They had been built by the hands of Poseidon and Apollo themselves, back when they served King Laomedon, Priam's father. The walls soared sky high, stones fitted so tightly no gap could be found. Towers rose like claws of iron, gates heavy as mountains. Looking up from outside, the Greeks knew this would not be a short war. And so, the conflict became a long siege. In the early years, the Greeks did not only attack Troy. They ravaged the surrounding lands, burning villages, seizing food, taking women as slaves, turning the coast of Troas into a living hell. They had to feed their armies, to weaken Troy from the outside. In those raids, many Greek heroes won renown, while countless innocents lost their homes, their lives. Achilles, the young invincible warrior, quickly became the nightmare of Troy. He and his myrmidons struck like storms, swift and merciless. Wherever Achilles set foot, fire burned and swords ran red. But those very triumphs planted the seeds of a fury that would later erupt. Inside the walls, the Trojans held firm. They had Hector, the eldest prince, pillar of their army. Unlike dreamy Paris, Hector was duty and honour incarnate. He rode at the front, driving back wave after wave, holding the gates. Hector fought not for love or vanity, but for family, for his father Priam, his wife Andromache, his infant son cradled in her arms. Many battles raged outside the walls. Blood soaked the beaches. The clash of swords against shields rang like thunder. Both sides suffered, but neither yielded. Troy stood unbroken. Greece endured, day after day, year after year. And in the lulls between battles, other stories unfolded. Hatred, jealousy, and ambition crept into the Greek camp. Agamemnon, during a raid, seized Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo. When the priest came to ransom her back, Agamemnon arrogantly refused. Apollo, enraged, sent arrows of plague into the Greek camp. Thousands fell sick, dying in agony. That arrogance of Agamemnon sparked a rift within the alliance itself, paving the way for Achilles' terrible wrath to come. But in those early years, one truth was clear. Neither side could win easily. Troy had its god-built walls, Greece its vast armies. Each passing day only piled more white bones upon the shore, more blood sinking into the earth. This was how the war began, not for Helen anymore, not only for an oath. It became a spiral of honor, hatred, and ambition that could not be stopped. 10 years of siege, and this was only the beginning. Throughout the 10 years of Troy's siege, hundreds of heroes from both Greece and Troy fell. But when the war is remembered, two names always blaze, like twin stars, one a fiery flame, the other steady and resolute. They were Achilles of Greece and Hector of Troy. Achilles, the son of the sea goddess Thetis and King Peleus, was destined to be the greatest hero of his age. As a child, his mother dipped his body into the river Styx to grant him immortality. Only his heel, where she held him, never touched the water, leaving a single vulnerable point at the heel of Achilles. He grew into a warrior of unmatched strength, swift as the wind, his spear strikes like thunderbolts. The Myrmidons under his command were fiercely loyal, sweeping across the battlefield like wolves on the plain. Achilles was not only a warrior, he was the symbol of blazing youth, of hunger for glory, and of arrogance. Each time he entered the fight, he surged forward like a raging flame, striking terror into the Trojans. But that same fire made even his allies wary, for it could turn in wrath against them just as easily. In contrast stood Hector, the eldest son of Priam. He was no child of a goddess. No magic shielded him. He was flesh and blood, wholly mortal. Yet that was what made him greater. He bore the duty of a prince, the protector of Troy, a husband, a father. No prophecy of immortality belonged to Hector, only his unyielding will. If Achilles fought to satisfy pride and glory, Hector fought for duty and love. Every sword he swung, every shield he raised was to protect his aging father, his wife Andromache, and his infant son Astyanax. He knew that if Troy fell, his family would be slaughtered, his people scattered. These two stars, though different, shone on the same sky of war. To the Greeks, Achilles was their pride, their unstoppable spear. To the Trojans, Hector was their living wall, their only hope against the Greek tide. Their battle did not come at once. Yet each time Achilles entered the field, Hector appeared to meet him. They were like two poles of war, drawn together, unable to avoid their final collision. It is said that once, during a pause in the fighting, Hector returned to the city and met his wife and child. Andromache wept, begging him not to return to battle, begging him to stay, for she feared she would lose him. Hector embraced them, but his voice was firm. "I cannot. I was born to defend Troy. If I shrink away, my people will despise me. My father will be shamed. I would rather fall before the gates than live in disgrace." Meanwhile, in the Greek camp, Achilles burned with fury over his quarrel with Agamemnon. When his prize of honor Briseis was taken from him, he withdrew from battle, leaving the Greeks in peril. His absence allowed Hector to shine brighter still, leading the Trojans to drive back the Greeks, pushing them even to the very ships. The two stars, one a flame of passion, the other a flame of duty, moved closer toward their destined clash. Fate had already decreed. Achilles and Hector could not both endure. One had to fall, so that this epic would echo through all ages. When Agamemnon insulted Achilles by seizing Briseis, his prize of honor, the flame of pride in Achilles' heart erupted. In the middle of the Greek camp he roared, "Not a single spear of mine will be raised for this alliance again. Find your own way to defeat Hector without Achilles." He withdrew, closed his tent, and refused to fight. With the Greeks robbed of their strongest spear, the balance of war shifted at once. Hector seized the moment. Leading the Trojan army, he stormed out like a tempest. The gates flung open. The wheels of his chariot screeched. Day after day, Hector drove the Greeks from the beach, pushing them back to their very ships. Wave after wave of Greeks broke before his shield and spear. Amid the shouts of victory, Troy tasted triumph for the first time. Despair spread among the Greeks. Camps burned, ships went up in flames. The stench of flesh and charred wood filled the air. Greek kings and chieftains knelt outside Achilles' tent, offering gifts, begging him to return. But Achilles remained cold. He would not forget the insult, nor forgive Agamemnon. In that moment of crisis, only one dared plead with him. Patroclus, his dearest friend, his brother in all but blood. Patroclus clasped Achilles, tears in his eyes. "My beloved friend, if your heart will not yield, then let me wear your armour, lead the Myrmidons into battle. When the Trojans see the shadow of Achilles, they will falter, and Greece will have a chance to breathe." Achilles looked at him, torn with anguish. At last, he nodded. "Wear my armour, Patroclus, but swear to me only drive them back from the ships. Do not chase them to the gates. Fate does not belong to you there." Patroclus donned the blazing golden armour of Achilles, shining like a god descended. The Myrmidons shouted with fury, charging with him into the fray. And indeed, at the sight of what seemed to be Achilles, the Trojans trembled. Patroclus drove them back, swept them from the ships, and the Greeks felt the fire of victory once more. But drunk on triumph, Patroclus forgot the warning. He spurred his horses onward, chasing to the very gates of Troy, daring fate itself. There, he met Hector. Their clash thundered across the plain. Brave though he was, Patroclus was not the true Achilles. Hector's spear struck home. Patroclus fell, his blood darkening the earth. With his last breath, Patroclus whispered, "Hector, your fate is sealed too. For after me, Achilles will come for you." When the news reached camp, it was as if lightning split Achilles' soul. He collapsed, clutching his head, his cries rolling like thunder. Grief turned to fury. He poured ash over his hair, lifted his face to the heavens, and called to the gods, cursing Hector. Thetis, his mother, heard his cries from the depths of the sea. Rising, she comforted him. She knew this was destiny. Achilles would return to battle, but it would be the path of no return. Thetis brought him new weapons forged by Hephaestus, the god of the forge. A shield engraved with the cosmos, armour that burned with fire, a sword sharp as lightning. Achilles armed himself and stepped from his tent. The Greek soldiers gazed in awe, not with fear, but with reverence, as though a god had descended. The bronze trumpets blared. Achilles raised his spear and swore, "Hector, your blood will answer for Patroclus. I, Achilles, will not rest until your body lies in the dust." The battlefield held its breath. All knew. Once Achilles' wrath had ignited, nothing could stop him. Blood would fall like rain, and Troy would tremble before the fury of his flame. Achilles stormed into battle like a fire that devoured everything. The spear in his hand struck again and again, every blow cutting down another life. The soldiers of Troy scattered in terror, warriors who once stood proud now cowering before the storm of bronze and steel. None could stop Achilles. His roar echoed across the plains of Troas. Even the river Scamander rose in fury, its waters running red with Trojan blood, surging to halt him. But still Achilles would not stop, still he slaughtered, still he hunted, Hector, the man, who had slain Patroclus. At last, Hector stepped forth from the gates. His eyes were steady, he knew fate could not be avoided. Priam and Hecuba, his aging parents atop the walls, wept and begged him to return. But Hector shook his head. He understood. If he fled, honour would die, Troy would die. And so he advanced, to meet Achilles on the plain where corpses already lay in heaps. Two warriors, one the star of pride, the other the star of duty, faced each other. Hector lunged first, his spear flashing like lightning. Achilles dodged, then countered. For the first time, Hector felt the weight of overwhelming strength. At last, Achilles drove his spear through Hector's throat. Blood poured out, and the earth of Troy trembled. Hector fell, his eyes still locked on his enemy, his final breath still clinging to honour. "Achilles, return my body to my father, that Troy may grieve me as I deserve." But in his wrath, Achilles was no longer human. He bound Hector's corpse to his chariot, dragging it around the walls, dust rising in clouds, the cries of Troy tearing the heavens. Priam, Hecuba, Andromache collapsed upon the walls. their hearts breaking as son, husband, father was dragged lifeless in shame. That victory made the Greeks believe Troy would soon collapse. But the walls still stood. 10 years of siege had not broken the god-built towers. Heroes fell, blood poured from both sides, but Troy stood tall as if defying the world itself. Then fate turned again. Paris, with an arrow guided by Apollo, struck Achilles in the heel, his only weakness. The invincible hero fell, his death cry shattering the sky. Greece lost its greatest flame, yet his death only hardened their resolve. Now the Greeks understood. Brute strength was not enough. No spear or sword could break the walls. They needed cunning, and the mind of Odysseus spoke. The plan was laid. Build a colossal wooden horse, hollow within, pretend to retreat, leave the horse as an offering to Athena. Inside its belly, the finest warriors led by Odysseus would hide, waiting for nightfall. The Trojans, worn thin by 10 years of war, weary from endless blood and tears, stood before the horse in doubt. Some warned, "Beware the Greek gift," so spoke Laocoon, the priest. But when he hurled his spear into its side, the gods sent 2 great serpents from the sea. They rose and crushed him and his sons to death. The people, terrified, believed it was a sign Athena accepted the offering. And so the gates opened, the wooden horse dragged inside. Cheers rang out, wine flowed, flames roared in a feast of victory. The Trojans believed the war was over. They did not know that within the horse, spears and swords waited to drench their city in blood. The walls still stood, but the hearts of men had fallen to deception. And when the night descended, Troy would walk into its final hour. That night, the skies over Troy were still. On the city square, great bonfires roared. The people sang, drank wine, believing that 10 years of suffering had finally ended. They danced around the colossal wooden horse, an image they thought was a divine gift. Laughter echoed through the streets, drowning out every whisper of doubt. When night fully fell, Troy slept in peace. Only the Aegean winds kept blowing, carrying cold air and omens of doom. Then, from the belly of the horse, wooden doors creaked open. Odysseus was the first to climb down, his eyes burning with vengeance. Behind him, dozens of elite Greek warriors crept out, bare feet pressing against the cold stones of the sleeping city. Silently, they cut down the guards and flung the gates open. Outside, the Greek fleet that had pretended to retreat had returned in darkness. As the gates swung wide, the tide of men poured in like a flood. Steel clashed, screams split the air, and the city awoke into a nightmare with no escape. The people of Troy rose in terror. Everywhere, flames spread, roofs collapsed, children screamed, women wailed. The Greeks rampaged like beasts unleashed, flooding every street, killing without mercy, sparing neither old nor young. The proud city was turned into hell. In the palace, old King Priam knelt before the altar of Zeus, clutching the statue in desperation. But Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, stormed in and cut him down at the very altar. The blood of the aged king stained the sacred stones. Hector was gone, but his wife Andromache and their infant son Astyanax remained. The Greeks gave the child no mercy. They hurled him from the city walls, his blood splattering the stones that once stood as Troy's pride. Andromache fainted, dragged away into slavery. And Helen, the flame that had sparked the war, stood amid the inferno, tears upon her face. Menelaus found her there. In his fury, the king of Sparta nearly struck her down, but before the beauty that made even blades tremble, he lowered his hand. Helen lived, yet bore forever the stain of being the cause of war. Each Greek hero claimed his share of glory, but each also sowed new sins. Ajax the Lesser defiled Athena's temple, seizing Cassandra and committing outrage upon her sacred ground. That crime would bring a curse upon the Greeks as they returned home. Odysseus, whose cunning toppled Troy, would pay with 10 years of wandering and peril. Amid screams and chaos, Troy, the pride of Asia, the golden gateway of the Aegean, blazed. Flames painted the heavens red, smoke towered as if to challenge the gods. The walls built by Poseidon and Apollo did not fall to sword or hammer, but to the hearts of men. That night, the epic closed in ashes. The city, once unbreakable, was reduced to ruins. Blood, tears, and fire fused together to write the final page of tragedy. But within the smoke of Troy, another spark flared. A young prince Aeneas was guided by the gods, carrying his aged father and young son to safety. One day, Aeneas would become the legendary forefather of Rome. Troy fell, but from its ashes another empire would rise. On the night Troy burned, humanity learned. War does not only take lives, it turns glory into ashes, love into tragedy, and leaves within human memory an epic that will never fade. Troy had burned to the ground. Black smoke faded, leaving a sea of ashes stretching from the city gates to the shore. Bodies lay scattered, the cries of grief silenced in the dust. 10 years of fire and blood had ended, but its echoes would resound. Not only in that generation, they would carry on for 1,000 years. The war did not only kill tens of thousands, it destroyed an entire civilization. Troy, the wealthy city, the golden gateway of the Aegean, vanished from the map. Its sacred walls, its gilded palaces, its bustling squares were reduced to rubble. Yet from those ashes the legend of Troy began to live forever. The Greeks returned some to their homelands, others perished on the way. The alliance thought itself victorious, but each hero carried home a tragedy of his own. Ajax the Lesser drowned at sea for offending the gods. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be betrayed by his wife and her lover, murdered in his own palace. Odysseus, the mastermind of the wooden horse, was cursed to wander 10 years more, meeting monsters and gods, losing nearly all his men before setting foot in Ithaca again. Even Menelaus, the man who reclaimed Helen, did not truly win. He brought her back to Sparta, but their love was forever stained with blood and ashes. Helen lived, but her name was bound to guilt and tragedy, never to be cleansed. For the Trojans, the war was not only loss, but also the beginning of another legend. Aeneas, the surviving prince, fled the city with a small band, carrying his aged father, Anchises on his shoulders and leading his young son Ascanius. They wandered, crossed the seas, and settled in a distant land where his descendants would one day found Rome. From the ashes of Troy, the seed of Rome was sown, opening a new chapter in human history. And above all, what remained were the stories. Centuries later, Homer gave voice to the epic in the Iliad and the Odyssey, etching its triumphs and tragedies into human memory. Heroes, kings, goddesses, betrayers, they all became immortal in song. Achilles, the blazing flame, fallen for a single vulnerable heel, reminded mankind that no one, however strong, escapes fate. Hector, the hero of duty, died defending his city, but left behind an eternal image of loyalty. Priam, the old king, who bowed before his enemy to beg for his son's body, stood as a symbol of paternal grief and noble dignity. Helen, the flame that began it, all became proof of the destructive power of love and beauty. The Trojan War was not merely a battle, it was a mirror of human nature, the thirst for glory, pride, love, loyalty, betrayal, and cruelty. Every hero was a fragment of humanity, an echo of ourselves, and that is why, thousands of years later, people still tell this story. At banquets, in poetry, in classrooms, on screens, Troy still burns, Achilles still roars, Hector still falls, and the wooden horse still rolls through the gates. For epics never truly end. They live on in imagination, in the tales of every generation. Troy may have fallen, but its legacy, its songs, its tragedies, its heroes still stand tall like indestructible walls in the memory of humankind.